Welcome to another episode of the Underground Bunker podcast. This is your proprietor, Tony Ortega, and I'm really thrilled to have John Atack back on the podcast by popular demand because, John, you really uncorked a beauty this week. You told me this was coming for a little while. I
Mm.
was looking forward to it. I myself have had to deal with a little Charles Manson misinformation over the years. But
Yeah.
wow, did you really dig into some interesting things this week? And I'm sure people would love to hear a little bit more about how you decided to do this piece and how it came together.
Mm. Well, it was really, I talked with Eric Hunley. Yeah, so after the show, Eric Hunley said to me, your friend Jolly West programmed the Manson family. And, that's a little bit of a surprise when, somebody who's a friend of yours years back and you kind of go, oh, yeah, he was responsible for setting up this mass murder. And, you like to think that you know your friends. It's like if somebody called me up and said, yeah, that Tony Ortega, he was actually responsible for sinking the Bismarck. You'd be kind of, okay.
Right.
So I ran off and picked up the copy of Chaos by O'Neill, which I bought some years ago. And, I'd put it down because it didn't mention Scientology. How can you write about Manson without mentioning Scientology? And so I read what he had to say about Jolly, and my jaw kept on dropping until it was pretty much on the floor because he doesn't have anything except, as he says, they walked the same corridors at some point.
That's not much in the way of corroborating evidence, is it?
No, and he spent 20 years writing this book, and the Times Literary Supplement called it a masterpiece. And it's such a subject. Manson is, a negative icon, let's say.
And the evidence of Manson's involvement in Scientology, I was surprised to find was really well documented.
Mm.
I really like Jeff Gwynn's biography of Manson that came out, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago.
Mm.
And he had, I think, gone to the same sources you have for these documents about that. Charlie spent so many years in custody in a penitentiary or something. And at one point in Washington State, he was in a prison, and his cellmate was a Scientologist, right? Isn't that how this all happened?
Yeah, Lania Raymer, who actually, one of the Scientology documents says that Lania Raymer was in prison because he'd robbed a bank so he could afford to pay for Scientology. Oh.
And this was about, I think it was a bit like 63 or something like that.
62, and
Okay.
it went on for 14 months. And Manson, by this time, is 27 years old. And by his own admission, he's just learned to read and write.
Ah.
And so he gets, according to Scientology's own internal documents, he gets something like 150 hours of Scientology processing. Now, just to clue people in a little bit here, I was involved in Scientology for 9 years. I probably didn't have 150 hours of auditing during that time. So that's like, it was over a 14-month period. So you're looking at the equivalent of like 3-hour-long sessions a week, something like that. And he says, I got pretty heavily involved in Dianetics and Scientology. He read everything he could. And of course, he did training routine 0. Very conveniently, Scientology provide us with a list of the processes that he did, which is all internal. It's all, we've got to stop this thing from happening. And the primary report, there are several documents. The primary one is from June 1970, which is to say it's a month before the Manson trial begins. And a report goes up to Mary Sue Hubbard, running the Guardian's Office of Scientology, to say, this is what we know. And he had these processes, he did these things. So this incredible situation, you have this guy, as he says, from the age of 12, for the next 20 years, he spends most of his time in institutions. And he's a little guy. He's 5'5" at maximum. And he gets beaten up a lot. Yeah, of course, it's right. not a happy place to be. Then he gets Scientology, And as he says, he gets confidence with this. He finds out that you can face people down. And, you get the famous 1,000-mile stare, the Manson stare. And you go, well, that's training routine zero. That's what we were trained to do. And it does. It intimidates people,
Well, and I remember from Gwynn's book that there was a note from the warden saying that they were happy that Charlie had found something, right?
Yeah. Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. So he had this intense Scientology training from a fellow inmate. What happened with his Scientology after he left that prison, John? What do we know?
We don't really know anything, except that when you look at Scientology's own documents, there were 3 other members of the family who'd done Scientology. Okay. And he says that at the largest, the family was 35 people. And you've got Leslie Van Houten, who's come up for parole. She was involved. You've got Bruce Davis, who also was sent to prison. Sandra Good. And she's one of the girls in Manson, the Lost Tapes, this incredible documentary that, somebody went down a week after Manson was arrested to Spahn's movie ranch and filmed these girls. They're young women possibly, but they're mainly teenagers.
Right.
And you see what's happened to them. They're sat there, they've all got buzz cuts. They're all sat there with kind of weapons and they're waiting for helter skelter. They're waiting for it to happen. And that was filmed and then put in somebody's garage and left.
Oh, wow.
And years later, somebody finds it and they go and interview, I think there were 5 women and 5 girls, and they interview them later on. And I think that gives you a much more complete idea of the process of conditioning that they'd been through, which is a kind of mixture of trauma bonding. One of the women says that Manson raped her brutally. And of course, he in his book is about what a nice guy he is and how lovely he is, which is a bit hard to believe, really. But he's, so you've got the trauma bonding, you've got the use of violence and overwhelming people, and you've then got that within the context of Scientology and this way of dealing with people. And I think it's perhaps been missed because Scientology appears to be so incredibly complicated, but it actually rests upon a very few ideas and then elaboration of processes and procedures. And at the heart of Scientology is the notion of control. There's a thing that bothered me a little when I was involved, that Hubbard says there is no such thing as bad control. Control is always good, and it's kind of, yeah, okay. But at the center of Scientology is this notion of infinite control. Hubbard, because he was a bit confused about the infinity symbol, used to stand it up and use the number 8 to replace the infinity symbol. Don't know why.
Right.
Maybe printers didn't have infinity symbols.
I was going to say maybe typewriters didn't have them in those days. So.
Yeah. And he couldn't write it in. But so, we got Scientology 0.8, Scientology 8.80, Scientology 8008. He was obsessed with this idea, which probably has some kind of Crowleyite background to it as well. But so he's at the heart of Scientology is that what you're going to do is you are going to become a kind of magician or sorcerer and be able to project your intention on other people. And what that boils down to in the C organization in Scientology is shouting. That you yell at people, you get really close to them so that they can feel the spittle hitting their face, and you give them a severe reality adjustment, which is called tone 40, which confused me in Scientology, because tone 40 is serenity of beingness, and there is nothing serene about this process, which I only witnessed once in all the time I was in Scientology. And when I did it, it sort of freaked me out. And then I discovered that Hubbard did it pretty much every day. He liked screaming at people. And And this whole idea of control, that you get people to submit to you, to your will, and do what you want, that's the core of Scientology. That's what the highest level, the operating Thetan Section 8 course, is about, becoming at cause over mental and physical matter, energy, space, and time. So you'll not only be able to shout at people and get them to do things, you'll be able to shout at, ashtrays and tables and refrigerators, and they will do your bidding. But this intention is the central idea of Scientology.
Absolutely. And I can see that being useful to somebody like Charlie, as he was finally out on the street after so many years behind bars, and made his way to Haight-Ashbury, right? And again, I really like Jeff Gwynn's book. What he was talking about was, he had spent all that time really soaking in Scientology, but he was the kind of guy, kind of like Hubbard, that was picking up other ideas and making them his and adding to his patter, so that by the time he started creating the family in Haight-Ashbury, he had a whole set of these notions that he had kind of, made his own. But that Scientology was definitely part of that mix.
I think it's the essential part. I mean, he says that at McNeil Island, he started reading books on psychiatry. I don't really see somebody who's just learned to read and write, reading the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual or anything like that. He says he was reading books on hypnosis, which is, of course, a less refined form of Scientology. But the Scientology is at the center of that. So yes, as with Hubbard, of course, a friend of mine went to St. Hill Manor many years ago in the 90s and was offered a tour. And he went into Warren Hubbard's office and he started writing down the titles of the books. And the next time he went, because he was rushed out, all the books had been taken off the shelves. And those books were kind of 1930s and 40s hypnosis manuals, 25 lessons in hypnotism. Hypnotism comes of age. I've found and read these stupid things. They were cheap novels, and they were Aleister Crowley books, and they were right there in his office. And I think that Manson, you're dealing with a similar kind of cunning mind. These are not intellectuals. Ron Hubbard was not somebody who had a deep education in philosophy and the classics. But he was very good at picking things out of Reader's Digest and the Boy's Own manuals, and then making them sound as if there was something, remarkable. I think Manson too had an eye for the main chance, and he knew what he was looking for. And I think there is, I think the Noel Emmons autobiography of Manson, and Emmons interviewed him over a period of years in prison. And I think it is a fairly genuine piece of work. You can see that Emmons has definitely corrected the language, I would think, looking at the way Manson spoke. But I think that he's tried to stay true to what's being said. And I think we see this conflict in Manson that you also see in Hubbard. I think Hubbard was trying to cure himself. So he came up with all of these procedures and processes, and right from the start in Dianetics, the mental science of modern health, he starts talking about, he gives you a list of all the things that Dianetics cures, and you go, well, this is odd. These are all things he suffered from. Asthma, short-sightedness, not long-sightedness, short-sightedness. Bursitis, which I'd never heard of, a lubrication between a muscle and a bone. And I think he desperately believed in the usual faith healing way. For 3 days, you feel great. And then, and down you go. So I think Hubbard somehow recognized that there was deep evil inside him. And in studying his background, I started to feel that the kind of good part of Hubbard probably came from his grandfather, Leif Waterbury, who, of course, his father was pretty much out of the picture when he was young. He lived with his mum and his aunts. Russell Miller interviewed Margaret Roberts, who was one of the aunts, who was only 8 years older than Hubbard, and somehow knew nothing about the time that he spent with the Blackfoot people when he was a child. She'd never heard about that before, even though he was in fact a blood brother at the age of 2 or 4. Right. or 6, depending which of his accounts. I went into the circle at the age of 2, and oh dear. But you've got this, I think, this drive that probably came from Waterbury, who I think gave him this sense of importance about himself, as we do with our children and our grandchildren. But Hubbard bought into this, and he wanted to be good. He wanted to be good. And there are still people out there. You sent me a link to something that Ken Urquhart had made. And I couldn't watch it. It's so sad to still be so besotted with a man who was throwing people, 25 feet from the deck of his ship into human sewage in Corfu Harbour, and go, he was the great savior of mankind. It's like, I'm afraid not. But I think that contest between good and evil happened in Manson as well. And the perception of Manson is that he was thoroughly evil. He was a devil, a demon. I don't think that's true. I think that he really did want to do something good when he gets out of prison, and in the spring of 67 gets to Haight-Ashbury. And things drifted, things went wrong. And part of his sense of good, you got the sense of he's picking up all of these runaway girls who've had, obviously a dreadful family experience, to be out there on the street at 14, 15 years old. And I think that he did, just as Hubbard told himself stories about how much good he was doing to the world, I think Manson was also believing the stories he was telling himself. But it gradually slid into crime and corruption. And then, I think the thing that really shocks me with O'Neill is he doesn't know anything about the datura, which is the drug that Manson and Tex Watson, who was imprisoned for the Tate and the LaBianca murders, he hasn't picked this up, and they both talk about it, and they both call it talache tea, which confused me until I found an ethnobotanist who was incredibly helpful. He came straight back to me and said, no, this is toloache, this is datura. And curiously, I'd encountered stuff about datura, and as a teenager, I got very interested in the criminalization of cannabis for reasons that people have probably worked out by now. At 17, I was busted for having, enough cannabis for a joint, which was a terrible thing back then. And so I read, what I'm like, I read what I could find, and I found out about the British India Hemp Drugs Commission, which I think is still the largest survey of drugs ever. It was in the 1890s, 10,000 people were interviewed. And at the end of this, there's an 8-volume report. And at the end of it, they say, cannabis should remain legal in India. There are no problems. Alcohol should remain illegal in India. It's a dreadful thing. And datura should be extirpated. And I'd never heard the word extirpated, pulled up by the roots.
Wow.
And because datura has never been made illegal, it's perfectly available. It grows all over the place. It's sold as a garden flower, one of the versions, Brugmansia. And every now and then you hear about somebody that smoked a leaf of it and ended up in hospital. They were boiling up the roots. And, it said, Tex Watson has said that the day before the Tate murders, he'd taken the stuff. And it lasts for about 3 days. So, and it's called a deliriant. It's not a drug like LSD where, things, shift around a little bit, but you still know where you are. You are placed in a different reality. You are in the middle of a nightmare. Ayahuasca and ibogaine are also deliriants and will put you into a completely altered reality. And, as my friend, the ethnobotanist, said, it is the very definition of a bad trip. So you've got people taking this and then taking LSD over the top of it. What do you think is going to happen? And they've been corralled into this way of thinking, the idea that 4 of them were Scientologists. And this is by Hubbard's definition of a Scientologist, by the way. Hubbard said that anybody that uses any aspect of Scientology is a Scientologist. So game, set, and match on that one. And that way of thinking, Manson was big on reincarnation. the essential principle of Scientology. And like Scientologists, he didn't realize that to Hindus and Buddhists, it's a bad thing. It's the wheel of suffering. It's the fear of the eternal return is the expression used by Buddhists. Whereas in Scientology, it's like, oh, I'll be able to do it in my next lifetime. And which, horribly and to some extent explains why the suicide rate is somewhat higher in Scientology, because people go, well, I've screwed up. I can do it in my next lifetime. Not really a good solution, I don't think.
So there's evidence of the presence of Scientology training, of this Datura drug being used, LSD being used. And so what you're saying is any serious attempt to understand where Charlie was coming from, how he controlled these people, and how they ended up committing these horrible crimes should take those things into account. I mean, obviously, it doesn't explain everything, but it's something that should inform a serious investigation. Instead, what you were concerned about was this book ignored all of those and instead pointed the finger at Jolly West, who was this academic who was maybe the Steve Kent of his day, right? A serious academic who looked at Scientology and was harassed by Scientology. And like you said, what alarmed you was there just wasn't very much evidence at all to make that case, right?
There wasn't anything. And that was what really got me. And in the piece with Eric Hunley and even more so in the article you've put up at the bunker, he repeatedly says, I don't have any evidence. This is speculation. And it bothers me because the presumption would be somebody who'd be willing to do that would have to be fairly twisted. What's being said is that he picks up Manson in the Haight-Ashbury in the spring of 1967, and we therefore would be saying that he was running the family for 2.5 years, even though O'Neill is not able to find any single connection between him and the member. 2.5 years of running that. And the idea that you take somebody like Manson and use them as your instrument in an MKUltra program to cause mass murder.
To what end?
Exactly. How would you be using this? And what we know about MKUltra is that it's a program that's stimulated by the fear that the Russians and the Chinese have found out how to make a Manchurian candidate, how to make a zombie that you can control, as Richard Condon's novel, then the brilliant Lawrence Harvey film, then the brilliant Denzel Washington film. People start feeling that this is somehow factual. It's fictional. And the way that it came out in the Russian purges under Stalin, that people, high-ranking officials were going on the stand and being filmed, confessing to things they could not possibly have done. And so it's like, this Pavlov and all of this is happening. No, they were saying, we will torture and kill your children if you don't say this. It's a traditional method, And while you can get somebody in the short term, part of my study, the whole subject has fascinated me for decades. So part of my study in the 1990s was of suicide bombers. And ultimately, there are only 2 people or 3 people I really trust on that. One's Ariel Mareri in Tel Aviv, and the other 2 are Anne Speckhart and Kaptra Akhmedova. And they studied the Black Widows in Chechnya. Lots of people like Gerald Post wrote about suicide bombers, but it's all at second hand. These people went and interviewed people who'd failed and the families of members, and they found out. And what Marari points out is that, yes, for the most part, and he studied hundreds of cases, what happens is a young person over the age of 17, this is one of the rules apparently in Palestine, over the age of 17 is recruited, and within 3 days they will be dead. So this is 2.5 years. No, if you want to get somebody into that berserk state where they will harm somebody, then it's done in a short period of time. But the other thing is it's done in a context. So in Israel and Palestine, we have a situation where there is a tremendous division between the 2 societies there that has hell of a history to it. And so you'll get situations where a 3-year-old, 3-year-old Palestinian or Israeli Arab child, they'll take them to a photographer, put a little suicide belt on them and have a picture taken. There's a cultural thing going on there. And within that context, you can get somebody to do something. But the kids who are recruited, you'll have what's called an engineer, who's the guy who makes the bombs, and then you'll have the recruiter. And they are the people who've got the qualifications and the intellectual equipment to set this up and do it. The dupe, who is going to die in this process, it's a very short-term process. These are not smart people generally. They're, upset kids. And of course, then you sell them the idea that when they wake up after the explosion, they'll have 70 horrors to play with in paradise. And, we don't really have anything that suggests that with Manson. The whole idea of helter-skelter seems to have been largely put together by Vincent Bugliosi, and I think O'Neill is great on the subject of Bugliosi and what a crackpot, corrupt psychopath he is. And there's that notion, psychopath. I only met Jolly 4 times, but we spent hours talking. And psychopath, O'Neill cites somebody who'd known him briefly as saying he was the most charming psychopath I ever met. Psychopath, a psychopath who criticized L. Ron Hubbard the first time, I think in 1952, and spent the next 47 years very publicly at going after Scientology. Why would a psychopath do that?
Yeah.
Put themselves in harm's way. He was a friend of Martin Luther King. He risked everything that people risked by joining the civil rights movement and being active. It just doesn't fit that character of person. And we now hear that O'Neill is I only said for the last 2 years he's been working on a book about Jolly West. So it's like, oh no. I'm rather hoping that we've scuppered that project, or he's a good researcher, or pointed him towards a place where he can say, actually, I was wrong. And, Jolly West was not the person I believe him to have been.
That's interesting that he's kind of going to keep going with that same subject.
Well, he says he's my great white whale, doesn't he? So he's like, and that's that poor Captain Ahab, I know he lost his leg, which is not good, but, that poor whale, all the things it had to put up with. Oh.
So, okay. So, you pointed to some really interesting ways that the whole Manson family and Manson himself should be looked at. So then, he's arrested, and this was, I got to tell you, this was new. I had not heard the words Operation Rawhide before. And so this is so once Manson is arrested, the Guardian's office freaks out, and they are going to try to find out everything they can about Manson and his involvement in Scientology. Tell me about that.
Well, it as I say, very soon after he's arrested, something comes in. And in the Guardian's office, as you're one of the few people who's really studied this subject and produced, fantastic book. The Unbreakable Miss Lovely is a wonderful book.
Thank you.
But so you've seen how the Guardian's office worked. This material is what's called red box data. So wherever there was a deputy guardian, they had a red box, and the red box was the stuff that had to be destroyed if there was a raid. When the FBI performed the largest raid in its history on Scientology in Washington, D.C. and LA, they got the red boxes. And the Manson stuff, Operation Rawhide, is red box material. It was never meant to see the light of day. I had a very strange conversation with a guy I was in the Bay Area back in '86, and I'd just held, 20 or 30 people had come up to hear me talk, and everybody had gone. We were in I was in LA. I wasn't in the Bay. I was in Sunland, and they had a hot tub outside, and I'm sat in the hot tub watching the lights, all that stuff in the valley. Great. And this guy comes along, and he's He knows he's come late. He's come late deliberately. He said, I want to meet you. My name is Joe Leonard. That's not my real name. That's always a good introduction, isn't it?
Right.
He said, I worked in Guardian's office, public relations. I am the only person who read all of the material that was seized by the FBI. I'm going to get in the hot tub. Let's talk. You know? And he said that there was a bureau in the Guardian's office that had never been made public called Bureau 4. So we had B1 and B2, covert and overt data collection. It's so nice that Hubbard actually put it on the organizing board that he got a covert data collection. We don't know what B3 might have been, but he's saying there's B4. And then he said they were the armed office of the Guardian's office. They and the operation, and he said that what happened with the Justice Department was they couldn't read Scientologies. So they didn't know R245 means kill somebody. And, you know, I mean, anybody's going to get lost in the loaded language that just, you know, 600-page dictionaries of absolute abject nonsense that Hubbard had come up with. And he said they had the reports, he'd read them, where they were, for example, going to gay clubs, gay bars, and he said that they would put a gun in the mouth of the owner of the club and say, if this guy comes in, you throw him out, and show them a picture of Quentin Hubbard, the successor to Scientology, who sadly committed suicide at the age of 22. So there's this other dynamic that's functioning. And I came away from that going, is this true? You know, I've nothing has ever confirmed it. I did interview somebody else who'd also reckoned to have read all of that material. I don't see how anybody could have read all that material. You know, there's just too much of it. But nonetheless, he didn't have anything about this. But there's this idea, you know, how did they get to the Manson thing that quickly? So the cover-up was, first of all, they found Lania Raymer, the man who'd audited him for 150 hours. And we have a list of some of the processes, you know, it's all carefully documented in the way that Scientology does. They then get Lania Raymer to write an affidavit saying, I've never been, I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of the Church of Scientology. And you're kind of going, how did you know how to audit that many processes if you weren't trained? Because they're not processes you'll find in the Scientology books. They're in the Scientology course materials. So they want to, they're going, this will break out. And of course, when the other week, Psychology Today ran a piece where, you know, about Leslie Van Houten, and Steve Hassan wrote the piece saying, you know, he thinks she should get parole because of the amount of control involved. And let's face it, it's been a long time, 50 years in prison, you know. And Psychology Today pulled the paragraph where he said she'd done, that Manson had 150 hours of auditing. I was in correspondence with them the same day and said, here is the document written to Mary Sue Hubbard. And I said, you know, I'm a court-appointed expert witness. I put this statement in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky in 1990, and I was sued for that book in New York and here. They didn't sue me over what I said about Manson, though. I think you're safe. And we got back this kind of anodyne, well, we don't have time to look at books and chapters. It's like, yeah, evil triumphs when women of good do nothing. So, yeah, this whole business that Scientology knew this and they wanted to deflect attention. And what Scientology had done with Psychology Today, and this is just over a week ago, is sent them an article from the Guardian newspaper in 1971, the UK Guardian, saying that there'd been this suit because they'd been libeled by saying that Manson had been involved with them. And this therefore proved that you mustn't say this. This was found convincing by Psychology Today. Of course, the documents that we've got came from the July 77 raid, so they were not there. So to this day, Scientology is working on this cover-up. And that stimulated me even more. I was already working on this piece. It was like, you know, this cowardice in the face of Scientology. It really isn't the right way to go. And of course, nobody knows that better than you. Nobody has done more in the last 10 years than you have, Tony, to stand up to it.
Well, it is amazing when how many years have you written about these things and established these facts and you've testified to them in court.
Yep.
Piece of Blue Sky was my first book about Scientology, and I read it before Russell's book, and I couldn't believe how good it was. And to this day, I still, it's the best history of the church. I love Russell's biography of Hubbard, but as far as the development of the church, your book is untouchable. And it's just amazing how for decades this stuff has been just established without a doubt in court cases, in publications, and yet Scientology says boo. And even today, these media organizations just crap their pants. Especially this year, for some reason, it's coming back a little bit, John. I think after Going Clear and Leah's show, there was a period where the media got a little braver, thanks to Alex Gibney, thanks especially to Mike and Leah and the incredible work they did. I think it bolstered media companies for a while, but now it feels like once again, I'm running into just editors that are so frightened, and there's no excuse for it. All this stuff, I mean, gosh, it is incredible. The documents we have, the patterns we are able to show, but anyway, that's a digression. But so I hadn't heard those words, Operation Rawhide. That was great. I'm glad you brought that into my story. I looked online. I can't find any other mention of it. I think you used those words for the first time at the bunker. So thank you.
There we go. Another first.
But I like that idea. I like that idea where they were panicked about this guy. We better check out what we know. They found evidence that he was involved in Scientology, and then they've spent the last 52 years denying it.
Yeah, and that thought that they collected the information, we would never have found this stuff out otherwise. It's and that's so typical of Scientology.
It is
the massive own goal complex of Scientology. I mean, to touch on what you said, I think the time suit. I think the time stood up, and that 20 years went by, and in 2011, they're vindicated, and that's the point where Janet Reitman writes her Rolling Stone article and gets a contract to write Inside Scientology, which is largely based upon my work and Russell's work, according to its own reference notes, which I am slightly annoyed about, but somebody had to make money out of it. It just wasn't me. But that was the point. Then you got South Park. Janet Reitman's Inside Scientology, and I think the South Park episode, I've long felt that had a tremendous significance, because I found that, there quite a number of people I met over the years had actually been recruited because they'd heard, it was Alexander Mitchell at the Sunday Times who put it out, that Hubbard had been involved with Crowleyite magic. And they joined because they wanted to do that. So it was sort of, you've got to have this balance. If you want to put somebody off the idea of Scientology, it is sinister and potentially very dangerous indeed, but it's also ridiculous. And if you put those two things packaged together, you get South Park. And then Anonymous made all of the noise they made. I really think that was a very badly planned campaign. I've often said they should have picketed the offices of rich Scientologists rather than Scientology orgs, because if business was failing, in that way, then that would have had more of an impact. And where that's happened, I think it has had some significance. But it became okay. So from 1990, when the original expurgated version of Blue Sky was released, through till 2011, I don't believe there was another book in the English language, 20 years. And then they started pouring out, especially, with being able to publish through, various platforms online. And some incredible memoirs came along. And this is something I was thinking about earlier today, that there really have been some remarkable first-person testimonies, starting with Dr. Joe Winter, Doctor's Report on Dianetics in 1951, where the guy who had published, Art Sepos, who'd published Dianetics, stopped the publication because he figured that Hubbard was a fraud, and then commissioned Winter, who'd been with Hubbard for 3 months solid, working on Dianetics and all this. And Winter thought that Dianetics was a good idea. I tend to disagree. But nonetheless, but he was saying, this Hubbard guy, he's whack, he is terrible. Then you get, say, Helen O'Brien's Dianetics in Limbo, which I don't think was ever actually published. It's in the Library of Congress, and she sent me a copy of the full manuscript. And she ran the Philadelphia doctorate course and all of Scientology in 52, 53.
Yeah.
And there's this horror story. And then we get more and more, Cyril Vosper's books, some good journalist books, George Malco, Paulette Cooper, C.H. Rolfe, all sorts of accounts. And I think there's a bit of a problem because there is so much material. And so for me, Blue Sky has remained relevant because it's the context in which these things happened. And often what I find is that people don't progress beyond telling their story. They're not curious enough to understand, how does it work? What was Hubbard drawing on? I went and read the books that he recommended. And you're going, look, you're Scientologists, you should read Hypnotism Comes of Age because he says you should read it. And there you find the techniques he's going to use. I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which was a real moment of revelation for me. I just took every reference I could find to hypnosis, suggestion, reverie, trance in the indices of Scientology's own books up from 50 to 52. And in that period, Hubbard was so candid about how you do this to people. And then you go, but he's describing what would later become the Scientology bridge, how you get, you enslave people psychologically. And of course, physically, ultimately, Scientology in this organization, it's a form of modern slavery. When I first interviewed Mike Rinder, and he said, I was 18 years old, I'd gone to the ship in I think Lisbon it was, in 1973, and I was going to train to be an executive in Australia. And they take his passport away and then say, you've been swapped. The organization we've given them some courses and they've given you to us. And so it has continued. I mean, Mark and Claire Headley's attempt to prove human trafficking. And the fear that you talked about that's there in the media, it's everywhere. It's in governments. And, I had a situation when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. He read a copy of Blue Sky and somebody who was there saw him actually try and give it to Jack Straw, who was the foreign minister, and he refused to take the book. It's laden with dark forces. And that kind of, will it get us any votes? Will it get, the idea that so many presidents in the US have allowed this criticism of Germany for being anti-religious. Secretaries of State have repeatedly said this. And we go back to Clinton, who said, when I was at Oxford, I had a chum who was a Scientologist, so it can't be that bad. And you're going, well, but do you know anything about it?
Right.
And that was Richard Rees, who I did know, who was not a very good advertisement for the benefits of Scientology, poor man. He was very depressed and upset and in charge of all of Scientology's auditing in the UK. There was a situation when I was at the end of my time in Scientology, in the morning he had Van Morrison in session, in the afternoon he had me, and we were the only two people. Richard was so high up, we were the only two people. He didn't work, obviously. Both Van Morrison and I left Scientology, but at that, just the whole idea of its size, that I think Amazon and Richard Dawkins have both talked about Scientology being a major religion. Now, you and I know it's got about 25,000 maybe signed up members, but it's like a frog that's puffed itself up to this huge size and has frightened people. And that intimidation, which is fundamental to Scientology, has scared people off. And that's that must now be making your job a bit more difficult.
Part of what motivates me is what you're getting at, and that is there's this intimidation factor because people are mystified by it, and demystifying it is something that I've always sought to do. For example, what Scientology actually is. You mentioned some things, but to me, it's always, you said ridiculous, but to me also, it's so repetitive and boring.
Yes.
And I want people to understand that. And also, at my website, at the, not my Substack, but at the original website, I have these quotes from Hubbard every day. I want people to see the actual things he said because they're so ridiculous. And when people start to really learn about the TRs and the grades and the OTs and the repetition, and the sort of like just sort of fantasy. I mean, when Hubbard's talking about PCs, making matter, appear and disappear, and you're thinking, does anybody really believe that? So I like to lift that veil a little bit to show people that the actual stuff of Scientology is so repetitive and kind of silly. And I hope that drains away some of the fear that it's actually better to laugh at Scientology than in front of it.
Yeah, I think it's very important to put it in perspective, and as the historian of Scientology, I became fascinated. I have this idea that for an academic, this is an impossible subject. Steve Kent and Sue Rain have done really important work. Steve and I met, a long distance when he was working on his first paper back, on the Rehabilitation Project Force in about 92 or 93. Wow. And I helped put together the collection that the university has there, University of Alberta, which is enormous. This other collector and I worked together, and we put together 100 bankers' boxes of material. But in digging into this stuff, as you say, it's incredibly repetitive. He really doesn't have many ideas. And, I wrote a paper called Probable Origins for Dianetics and Scientology, because that interested me too. That, and that came off a paper that Jeff Jacobson had written. Jeff did great work. But what he'd done was said, this idea exists here, and Hubbard uses it. What I did was to say, and this is where Hubbard mentions this source. So for one of the simplest things, the idea of the trauma of birth, the birth engram. On the back cover of Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, there is an advertisement for a book by Dr. Nandor Fodor called The Search for the Beloved, the Trauma of Birth and Prenatal Conditioning. So this was published a year before by the same publisher. So you're finding that these wonderful, and Aleister Crowley also talked about this, you're finding that these ideas come from somewhere else, and that he's just caught hold of a few of them, and they're simplistic. His view of the universe is pathetic. And he then makes all sorts of outrageous claims. We can cure cancer, leukemia, we can raise people from the dead. And you kind of go, it's not really happening, any of this. Talking with Karen de la Carrière last year, she said, nobody's more experienced in Scientology than Karen. 46 years, one of only 8 people trained to the highest level, the class 12 case supervisor, all of these years. And she was saying that whenever you say to somebody, I don't believe in it anymore, they go, but didn't you have any wins? And it's sort of, but look at all of these claims. You'll be a perfect human being. You'll never catch a cold again. You'll be emotionally completely stable, and everything will be wonderful if you do this stuff. 1950 version, 1951 version, 1950. The same promises being made repeatedly. When I interviewed John McMaster, who was the world's first real clear, Hubbard for 15 years had been selling this. John said, I don't really know why he made me the first clear. I'd been doing it for some months, and he came to me one day and he said, right, you're done. And it was weird. A few years later, but maybe 10 years later in the 90s, I had a call from a guy who was a Hollywood set designer. And he said, he'd always wondered, he said, I was one of the first 10 clears. And he said, and the thing that surprised us was that 7 of us were gay. We called ourselves the queer clears. Why do you think that is, John? And it's like, you haven't worked that out yet, that you were blackmailable, you know? And so Hubbard had, and John McMaster, you know, dear, what a character. He was so beloved. There were so many people who saw him talk and who just were rapturous about him.
Well, see, and that's an interesting notion that Hubbard knew how to take advantage of that. Hubbard recognized in McMaster that he was charismatic. He was a great speaker. I mean, I've read the same things you have about what an impression he made on people and what a great ambassador he was for Scientology. That's why Hubbard put him out there. Now, for the, you know, because Hubbard, I think, he was a little different than Miscavige in that way, because Miscavige has something similar today in Grant Cardone. You know, every time Grant Cardone is put out there, we've seen evidence of it in LA. I've seen evidence of it in Florida. He draws a massive crowd, which is very hard now in Scientology.
Oh, yeah.
Of very, very enthusiastic people. And I have wondered why. And also, he's not afraid to say, yeah, I'm a Scientologist, which is becoming so rare for people in public view. And I have wondered why Miscavige doesn't use him more. And I just have to conclude it's just inferiority, that he hates the idea of somebody else getting the limelight. Whereas apparently Hubbard, to a certain amount, allowed that with McMaster until he turned on him, right?
Yeah, but McMaster told me that Hubbard was incredibly jealous.
Okay.
So he would come off a stage and have all this applause, and Hubbard would be sulking and upset about it.
Interesting.
Let's put a little story on the record. Janice Gillum Grady, in her excellent, the first volume of Commodore's Messenger, which is a really touching book, she talks about why John McMaster left, and she doesn't have the right information. John told me why he left. He left because he was overboarded. He was thrown into the water, and he broke his collarbone on the way down, and he spent 2 hours in the water screaming, trying to have them get him out. So that's L. Ron Hubbard, the man who was going to relieve all of our trauma. That was the way that he behaved.
Right.
But with John, it was just this weird charade that he traveled all around the world with a secretary called Colin. And because we'd all left, and I really wasn't interested in doing any more Scientology, but I knew about the Gay Theatre Association in Los Angeles. So I wrote to John and I said, it's okay to be gay, it's fine. And I got a 7-page handwritten letter saying, I am not a homosexual, and it was weird because when I was in Sunland, I stayed in the house he'd been in 3 months before, and the woman said, I had to throw him out because I have 2 teenage daughters, and I came home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and he was chasing his boyfriend naked around the house, but he was not a homosexual. So you've got this deception that, is so much a part of Scientology and so much a part of any authoritarian cult where you have some person who in public, they look one way, they seem to be wonderful. So you look at, say, Rajneesh, doing these me nasty sort of stuff. And then you find out who he was behind the screen, that right. He was this absolutely, horrific human being who, and this is the point with Hubbard, which is certainly not true of Jolly West. Hubbard didn't care about anybody but himself. When he hears that Quentin has killed himself, his son has killed himself, he's like, oh, more bad public relations. That's his response. He was inhumanly self-obsessed. And certainly in dealing with Jolly West, he was somebody who was deeply concerned. Somebody told me a year or so back, I did a thing where I mentioned Jolly West, and somebody said, oh, but he was involved with Waco. And I said, well, that's interesting you should say that, because I was with him in Los Angeles while Waco was going on. And you're quite right. He was ringing the FBI and the ATF up and saying, "What on earth are you doing?" So, very easy to twist stories and get the wrong idea about something.
Well, I certainly heard a lot about him when I was starting out in the '90s, and but I appreciate that you really have filled out the picture for us a little bit more with that piece this week. Like I said, it got just wonderful reaction from my readers. They absolutely loved it, and we appreciate it anytime you're in the bunker, Jon.
Well, thank you, and we need to make sure that every 6 months or something we talk and see what's going on, because the bunker is a really special place, a really unique place. And when we first were in touch, which is 10 years ago now, that thought that there was a place where I could put material that might be helpful to people who'd been involved with Scientology, so the 60 or 70 articles that you put up, that was a new thing, having somewhere that people could come and of course my view of Scientology, having dealt with about 600 people in their recovery, their progression away from it, and seeing how stuck people get. And I came back then after I'd had 16 years of harassment and a little bit of peace and quiet in between, 17 years, and coming back and being able to say, actually, people don't naturally recover from Scientology. You remember there was a piece where I said something about Conway and Siegelman, and you went off and contacted them and proved me wrong. And I was in touch with them after that, which was great, because I said, you said that Scientology is, the hardest thing to recover from of all of the groups you've looked at, that where with, the Krishnas or the Moonies, 3 to 6 months later, you're back in society. And they got this strange estimate, which is 12 and a half years for Scientology. And I went to them and said, that was a guess, wasn't it? Because the reality is that many people will never recover. They replace the language. And that started me thinking about Scientology in Hubbard's own terms, that what he kept talking about was implanting. And so in his terms, Scientology is a way of implanting the ideas of L. Ron Hubbard into somebody, and they will tend to keep on believing. You can't use evidence. I've done all the stuff on evidence. You've got to get into, how did he put this into somebody's head, and how can they now start thinking about it, which is not an elaborate process. If as soon as somebody is willing to challenge one of his ideas and say, that's a silly idea. When I was surprised when I talked with Aaron Smith-Levin, that, towards the end of our conversation, I asked him about his recovery, and he said, what recovery? And he said, some of the ideas in Scientology are good ideas. And I'm sort of, I don't think so. Having had, 50 years of involvement with this thing, I really don't think so. Anything that seems good is better stated in the source he stole it from, because he couldn't keep anything straight. And I went through the, affinity reality communication. If you increase communication, you will always increase affinity. And I said, so you shoot somebody, you shout at somebody, that's not going to increase their affinity, is it? So this scientific formulation is nonsense. And the resistance to that people have, the cognitive dissonance that it evokes, Scientology is an incredible trap, where with
like in a trap sense, I was just going to say, like with the winds thing, for example, you set up this mentality where anything good that happens in your life, you automatically credit it to Scientology. Anything bad that happens in your life, you blame yourself for not doing Scientology standardly.
You did not apply the technology correctly. And it's the same in every authoritarian cult. All good flows from the leader and the doctrine, and whatever is wrong, and there's always quite a lot wrong, is because you didn't do it properly. So you're always the fall guy in that situation. The other thing is, and somebody, early on, I wrote a piece for the bunker about training routine 0, and somebody in the comments said that they'd felt that in doing training routines, they were being trained to be a sociopath. And that was such an insightful comment, kind of going, well, actually, Scientology is a way of developing narcissistic sociopathy. So people become totally self-involved. They become little Hubbards where it's all about getting the next level. It's all about doing the next course. And if, like Lania Raymer, they need to rob a bank so that they can do it, then that's what they'll do, you know. And they become auditing junkies. That whole process of Scientology, which is you have very good indicators at the end of your session, which is the euphoria that just about, you know, you can stimulate that in people with such ease. But people don't know that. They're not taught about the Ganzfeld effect and how you can, you know, create a euphoric state in somebody in 10 minutes. I remember when I was still involved, I had this guy who'd been, he was a hippie, he'd been taking acid, and he thought this was really great. And I said, I can actually get you to experience this without drugs. All you have to do is training routine 0. And sure enough, within 10 minutes, of course, he was hallucinating, because that's the Ganzfeld effect. And he was quite keen on it, and may not have been the right thing, because he actually went and joined the Ministry of Defense, you know, after that. So you may have tilted him in the wrong direction. You know?
Wow. Well, listen, this again, I really appreciate you thinking of the bunker for this piece. I'm glad we could put it out. You had said to me when we were going back and forth, you apologized for the length, but this is what I love about the Underground Bunkers audience. They care about this subject. They care about this level of detail. And that's what I saw again and again in the comments, is how much they really appreciated that you dug deep here. So for the Underground Bunker audience, I'm saying thank you, Jon. Thank you for thinking of us, and I can't wait for your next one, man.
Great. And let me just, you know, do a puff. We've just released the audio book of Scientology, the Cult of Greed. Now, this was a talk that I gave some years ago. But what I wanted to do, years ago, I wrote a thing called The Total Freedom Trap. And I came back to it to revise it and went, this really doesn't have the material I want. What I want to be able to do is highlight the worst of Scientology. And when people have, and a few people have, criticized the history that I put forward of Scientology, and the thing I have to say to them is that the main source of this history is Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
You know, I talked with, there were about 150 people involved one way or another, interviews I did, books I read, testimony. But most of the material comes from Hubbard. And the same is true with Cult of Greed, that you have, you know, for example, his 1947, the letter where he asked for psychiatric treatment, having just developed a process that cured everything. You know, he's begging because his mind is deranged to get his treatment. The 1949, January 49 letter that you found to Forry Ackerman, his agent, where he's saying he can rape women without them knowing about it. He's not talking about helping anybody. He's saying there are more money-making angles.
That's right.
So I would urge everybody to rush out and grab a copy of Scientology Cult of Greed as an audio book, as an ebook, it's cheap. It's me reading it. Imagine that.
Well, and make sure you give me a link so I can include it in the post when we put up this video. Okay. All right, Jon. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you.
And thanks for staying up late. I know it's late over there.
It's fine. Always good to talk to you.
All righty. Bye-bye.